Squirrels! So hello, and welcome to another Legends of Runeterra video. My name is Chris, and today we're going to be talking about balance, and particularly region balance, which I think is something that, we as players perhaps don't think about as much. I think the developers do, that and I'll give you an example of that very soon. But I think us players are more focused on like deck balance and specific card balance rather than perhaps looking at a bigger region picture. But this is what I want to talk about today because I think that I've noticed like there might be a slight issue with the way that the devs tackle region balance. Not an issue with the way that they tackle it, but perhaps that they aren't doing enough in a certain area. And let me explain what I mean. So here's patch 2.5, which is kind of the last big balance patch that we got. It's the one where Twisted Fate got nerfed and Fiora got nerfed, right? And so essentially what happened was Bilgewater, they kind of went, okay, Bilgewater's been too good, now let's bring it down. So we had a Twisted Fate nerf, and we also had like Pick a Card and Wiggly Bubblefish, all three pretty important cards, particularly in TF Fizz, all getting nerfs. And so what the devs often try to do is they try and go, okay, well, we've nerfed Bilgewater in one way, how can we buff it in a different way? And so what they did was, okay, let's change Dread Dredgers back so that Deep gets a bit better, and let's change the Dreadway as well, give it a mana reduction so that Gangplank decks get a bit better as well. So, and this was kind of like they mentioned here was also to change the concurrent timelines deck as well. So, I mean, you could say that this wasn't necessarily a buff that was intended, but obviously for Gangplank deck versions, this is a buff. And they do this in other ways as well, with Fiora nerf, even though Demacia wasn't, crazy good. Even so, they nerfed Fiora, they gave Jarvan and Shyvana a buff. Jarvan we haven't seen too much of, but Shyvana, it did help, and we have seen dragons enter the meta, perhaps for the first time. So you could call that a success. But I think what has happened here in general with the game is that this has happened a lot. Certain regions will be the best region for a while or, a short time and, will get nerfed. The best things often do get nerfed in this game. And they'll often try and, throw a bone to the region and be like, well, try this. But I've sort of noticed that a lot of the times, and in my mind, really looking back, only once has this really worked where they have decided to nerf, quite a few cards within a region, but then the actual buffs that they give the other cards have sustained that region as, having still a viable tier 1 deck. I mean, you can look at it with Bilgewater now. A lot of people agree that Bilgewater right now is terrible. Because essentially Twisted Fate was carrying the region on his own, and the rest of the region has kind of slowly gotten nerfs over the course of time, and I think that this is kind of the main cause of that issue, is that things like Nab were nerfed a long time ago, Make It Rain nerfed a long time ago, Riptide Rex quite a while ago now, and this kind of just slowly builds up. But it is still possible for perhaps one champion to still carry that region and make it seem viable. But then as soon as that champion gets nerfed as well, the whole thing falls apart, and now you're left with a region where there are very few strong cards, which is what a lot of people are complaining about for Bilgewater at the moment. And this has happened with other regions as well. We've seen it with Ionia happen multiple times. In fact, elusives way back in the day, got nerfed pretty heavily. A lot of different Ionian cards got nerfed for the elusive deck, but then Karma was sort of able to sort of carry on Ionia as a region and kind of sustain that, but then Karma got nerfed, and then Lee Sin got buffed, which was kind of the extra buff, and then Lee Sin carried the region for a while, then Lee Sin got nerfed, and then Ionia went on that big drought until Aurelia came out, right? And I think that is the problem, that we've had these sort of big region droughts where essentially there is nothing to do with a certain region, and that of course is a pretty big problem if you enjoy playing a certain region and it's really bad. And so what I'm really questioning here is the execution of these changes, because I agree with the philosophy of trying to buff other things, as one thing comes down in a region, go play with this if you enjoy this region instead. I agree with that philosophy, but I feel like the execution has just been a little short of where it needs to be, because I feel like we've seen too many times now where a region does get nerfs over time, And then we do get that big extended drought where a region can't be played. And we've seen it with pretty much every region at this point. Maybe not the newer ones, but of the original ones, aside from Shadow Isles, which has kind of been considerably, pretty good and was completely insane at the very start of the game. Outside of Shadow Isles, kind of every other region has seen its time as a peak and then seen a large area of weak time as well, where it hasn't really been played as much. But there is one region, I think, and one patch in particular we can look at where I did think, yeah, maybe that was one where they got it right, where these kind of changes that they make to a Dredges or a Dreadway actually were significant enough to carry on a region still being able to compete in a tier 1 and perhaps hasn't disappeared as much as some others, even though there have been nerfs to this region as well later on. And that patch was this one, patch 1.4, because what happened in 1.4, which is a somewhat infamous patch at this point, because there was such big changes, was there was a lot of big changes in this patch. As you can see, this was the Anivia Braum patch, but what I'm focusing on is Darius. The Darius change and the whole Noxus change was very important, because what happened essentially was you had, at this time, there was a PNZ, Piltover and Zorn, and Noxus deck that was like an aggro burn deck that was just really, really strong, and, basically had a bunch of small units like Boom Crew Rookie and Legion Saboteur and Crimson Disciple and Imperial Demolitionist, and basically just aimed to just deal damage to your face as quickly as it could, without really caring about combat. It was just about dealing direct damage to your face completely. And essentially, they started to nerf that deck. There might even be some nerfs in here, if I'm not mistaken. Although maybe not in this particular one. But I think it got nerfed a bit before and a bit after this patch, some of those cards. And so those cards got nerfed, Legion Rearguard and Crimson Disciple, and I'm sure there's some others that I'm forgetting from Noxus as well. But what they did was they changed Noxian cards and gave them a completely new deck that didn't exist before. But I feel like the difference between what we saw with the Dredges buff and the Dreadway buff is that these changes were pretty big and were all sort of in the same deck. And let me explain. So you've got this Darius change, right, from 5 to 6 health. And then you've also, if we scroll down, got this Basilisk Rider change where they gave Basilisk Rider an extra health as well, so that when you get Allegiance, he would become a 6/4. You also got a Captain Farron change, which, made him from one of the worst 8 mana cards in the game to perhaps the best 8 mana card in the game overall. And these 3 changes all fit the same deck. Out of these changes came the Darrowing deck, which is essentially a big boy overwhelm Noxus deck, which we had never really seen before, and it worked, and it kept Noxus at, and that was a tier 1 deck, so it kept Noxus at the forefront of the game and allowed you to, if you were a Noxian enjoyer, to play that and still feel like, okay, Noxus is still strong, I have a good Noxian deck, and even more Noxian deck, because it was an Allegiance deck, which was really, really cool. Now, this deck, was a tier 1 deck. It ended up getting nerfed. Basilisk Rider got nerfed. Eventually, Captain Farron will get nerfed, a long time later, and Darius is still the same. So not that much change, really. It was just Basilisk Rider, so it wasn't like a crazy, insane, overpowered deck. It was sort of your average good tier 1 deck that maybe needed a slight bit of tuning that it eventually got. But to me, this represents the sort of single time that I can think of where these changes all really mattered. And so what has been different from this one to the others? And I think the key difference is that if you look at all these changes, they're clearly all intended for the same deck. Basilisk Rider, Captain Farron, and Darius all go in the same deck. They all have Overwhelm on them. Well, if you get the Allegiance on Basilisk Rider. And they're all sort of these big units, that work pretty well, with Harrowing. That was sort of the deck that came out of it. But they all have the same theme and idea behind them. Whereas I think what we've seen, and you can see it with the Dredges and Dreadway changes, those are in different decks. That's like small little changes to different decks. And I feel like that's where things have gone wrong. Instead of targeting and saying, okay, Bilgewater was Twisted Fates region. Now, here's a bunch of things that Gangplank. Go and play Gangplank. If they change, for instance, like Parlay, or what's the slow card called? Boom Ship or something, Doom Ship. You know, if they changed cards like that that had some powder keg synergy and were to do with Gangplank or Plunder in general, that might work. And I feel like I wish this is what this whole video is about, basically, is just explaining that that is how I think the execution of this should be. That they should be targeting, okay, Gangplank is an okay champion, but has maybe never really seen like top level play. That's a good champion that could be the leader of Bilgewater for a while. Now that we've nursed Twisted Fate, we can make this, a Gangplank region. Maybe, Gangplank Sejuani can come about, or Gangplank Noxus, or I know we have seen Pyre aggro, so maybe that's not the best idea, but Gangplank sort of wasn't the focus of that deck, if you understand what I mean. But having Gangplank or a Gangplank centered deck be the real driving force behind Bilgewater, and you do that by having buffs to multiple cards that fit within Gangplank. That would be like a Riptide Rex again, changing that back, as I mentioned, Parlay, any card that helps you hit the Nexus damage, to help level him up. All of those cards would be good. And this is essentially all I wanted to say, that hopefully what I'm hoping for in this next patch, which they've promised will be a big patch again, I'm hoping that for regions, and at the moment it probably is Bilgewater, that for certain regions they target things, that they say, here is a deck that can be good. And maybe, it might need a nerf down the line. But I'm okay with that. It's okay to create tier 1 decks and then rein them in. I actually think that that's a pretty good way of doing things, because you end up with this cycle of, this is fresh, no one's really seen a really great Gangplank deck before in a little while. Here is one. It comes back down. Here's now let's do Fizz. Now let's do Deep. You could do all these different things and make them better at different times, and then just scale them back if they need scaling back. And I feel like that is what we're missing with a lot of these changes, is that oftentimes they'll just sort of throw a bone to like one card in a certain deck and maybe another bone to a certain card in a different deck that don't really go together, and you end up with a region as a whole that's a bit lost, that doesn't have really a whole cohesive deck that you can play together. So with that said, I'd love to know your thoughts, if you agree with me, or if you think maybe they shouldn't do that, because regions as a whole should go up and down. That could be an argument you could make. But with that said, thank you so much for watching. I'll be back tomorrow with another Legends of Runeterra video that might include more about this infamous patch 1.4. But with that said, thank you so much for watching, and have a really nice day.